In this chapter, we're going to be going over a feature of Vray called the Vray physical camera. And in this Vray physical camera, it's going to basically turn your camera into a camera with attributes that feel a little bit more like an actual camera. That's the name, physical camera. It's a pretty straightforward set of attributes. We're going to go over in this lesson, in this video, and just kind of talk through some of the different pieces. But there's a little bit of prep work I want to do first. So the Vray physical camera tends to mess with your horizontal and vertical film aperture, and more likely than not, especially if you're in any sort of animation pipeline, you do want to have these established prior to going into lighting. So I'm actually just going to lock all these attributes, and don't want to skip. I'm just going to say lock selected. So I want to keep these established, and I don't want Vray to go in and mess with this at all. So if I go in now to my attribute editor, let's get this turned on. So I can go into attributes, Vray, physical camera, and I'm just going to scroll down a little bit, and you can see this whole new set of attributes exposed in my extra Vray attributes on my camera shape node. Let's go ahead and turn that on. This top section here, discussing film gate, focal length, all that, that's exactly the stuff that I wanted to leave alone. You can see I didn't really want to have film gate or focal length getting modified at all. I want that to come from Maya. So all of that is going to be coming from my Maya camera, meaning that what I see in my resolution gate right here is going to match what I see in my render. So the first thing that's kind of interesting that we have inside of our physical camera is going to be this distortion. Generally speaking, this is something that we want to do in comp. And that being said, a lot of the stuff that you're using the physical camera for, you are going to be wanting to do in comp. But that being said, it's kind of nice for test renders and that kind of thing. And in this case, with my lens distortion, you can see I cranked that up to a +1. And if I go ahead and let's turn off our set A. Actually, you can see if I... So our render is very dark. All right. Before we get into all of our attributes here, let's take a look at what our render is going to be looking like. So let's load this up here, and there we go. So you can see this is from our lights demo talking about Vray light meshes. So we've got a really bright light source here and some of our wood pieces that we were displacing, messing around with. And this is going to be our kind of just simple test scene to look at some of these attributes. First things first, when you first turn on, first things first, when you turn on these attributes, what you'll notice if you do a test render is that everything has gotten much darker. And if we look at the attributes, it will make quite a bit of sense why it just got so much darker. So if we select my shot camera, you can see that I've introduced a lot of new controls for the brightness of my image. You can see we have an f-stop number, a shutter speed, and an ISO. I want to preface this whole lesson by saying that there's actually quite a bit of reason to ignore the physical camera in production settings because you're going to be taking care of a lot of this stuff in comp. If you have light sources that are dialed in a physical way, and they're all part of a very large pipeline, let's say, that are using properly calibrated light information from sets, then it can make a lot of sense to use the physical camera because you're able to dial in these numbers that match your on-set camera. And in that way, your EXRs that may be having values for the lights that are very high may match because you have the proper f-stop number. So all this stuff can fall into place and get you a little bit closer than you would have normally been. But for the general user that's not involved in those pipelines, you can see that it's adding 3 additional brightness controls. And unless you really need it, sometimes it's easier to just kind of ignore this stuff. So anyways, that being said, the feature set is pretty cool for the physical camera. And I do totally use it for some of my still images, just playing around. And then I'll end up replicating some more of this on the comp side and turning some of it off. But you can see back to where we were, our image is really dark. Our f-stop is actually set to 8, which is, it's not super dark. Like a f22 would be very little light. You can see now with that set to f22, this is actually kind of properly exposing our light beam here. But let's bring this down to something like 1.4. 1.4 actually, I didn't plan that, but this is actually fairly close to the intensity of that original image we're looking at. So, lowering that f-stop means the camera is bringing in more light, and the shape of the iris is going to be larger. If I go in and change some of this other stuff like shutter speed, the value for the shutter speed here and the value for the f-stop is actually going to be directly linked to, for shutter speed, motion blur, and f-stop, depth of field. I do have my light mesh animating here. So if I turn on motion blur, I might get a little bit of blur with that, but I'm going to keep the render fast for now. I actually am going to turn on depth of field though. So if I scroll down and I turn on depth of field, you can see that this whole thing goes fairly soft. And I'm going to turn on the specify focus checkbox. And now I want to pick this board, and you can see under display, heads up display, I have my object details turned on, so I can see that that's 687 units away. So let's set that focus point to 687. And this is really one of the first things I want to show with a physical camera that I truly love. Because these attributes are all very much physically based, having the actual f-stop number as opposed to a size, like if I look at the regular Vray depth of field, which by the way, if you turn on depth of field over here, it is going to ignore it if it's on in the physical camera. The physical camera depth of field will always take precedence. This attribute though, on the render setting side, is a aperture size in millimeters. And to me, I do quite a bit of photography, and I actually would greatly prefer this f-stop number over here. They'll turn that off. Because this aperture size in millimeters, I have no idea what that would be for different lenses. So it's much more difficult to figure out exactly what I'm even looking at. So I'll turn that off again. This 1.4 I know is going to be a fairly shallow amount of focus. And so if I set this to even 1.2, you can see that these objects get a little bit more out of focus. So let's go in and just create because these objects are actually fairly far away. If I look at the way my scene is set up, I have a very large softbox over here. My camera is right there. My objects are over here. So let's create a little sphere and bring it right out in front of our camera. Cool. So you can see that sphere is completely out of focus. Very, very blurry. If I set my focus range on my camera now, it's actually completely transparent. Would look very beautiful if I did an animation of a rack focus or something. But if I was to set my focus range to 255, and I'll bring that sphere into focus, you can see how much these other objects are completely shoved out of focus. And that is because I am at an f-stop number of 1.2. If I wanted that to be a little bit, less intense, something a little bit more realistic, I could bring this value up to say something. Actually, sorry, realistic was not the right word, but something rather than having the shallow focus, a more deeper focus, so less of the objects are blooming out like this. I can go in and set this to maybe like 8 again. You can see everything gets very dark. So I'll have to compensate for that, but you can already see the line is much more in focus. And now I can start dialing some of these other values to adjust the brightness back up. So let's set my shutter speed to 48. That's going to brighten it back up. These two values right here, I'm going to be fairly locked into. What I mean by that is that if I choose a shutter speed that looks good with my motion blur, and I choose a f-stop that works well for my depth of field, in this case right here, I feel like it's working pretty well. I only have one more slider I can use to adjust the brightness of my image back up to where I want it to be, and that's going to be this ISO. If you're done any photography, the ISO is your essentially film sensitivity, and on digital cameras, if you increase this value, you will create a grainier image. So let's say you have a DSLR and you set it to an ISO of 5000, that would be a very grainy image. In CG world, though, we don't really have that issue of grain. It can really just be a general purpose slider to brighten up the image. So let's set that to 1000, and you can see it actually worked pretty well, and we're right back to where we want to be. Now if I set this focus back to 600, you can see that that board falls into focus, the sphere falls back out of focus, and generally speaking, that area of what's in focus is much deeper. And that's where those terms shallow and deep focus come from. So that's actually feeling quite beautiful the way I have it right here. And so that would be a really nice way to dial these three settings. I'm going to stop this real quick, and I'm just going to animate my sphere here. So we're on frame 31, so I'll just set a keyframe there. And over here, something like that. So that's probably a little too fast, so let's move that guy. So that's some fairly normal motion, I would say. So let's actually just delete that. Cool, something right around in there. Maybe we'll... So are we at frame 31? Okay, right. So if I was to go ahead and turn on our IPR again, oops, sorry, right down here. Select our shot camera and turn on motion blur. And I do want to go ahead and let's just redo that IPR. There we go. So you can see I am getting some little bit of motion blur on that object, and it would be a little clearer if I bring that into focus again. So let me go ahead and select my camera. And we'll set that focus point to 255. And you can see, even though it's in focus, it is still blurring by, which is pretty cool. So let's change frames. You can also, this will all update totally fine. Sorry, I lied. If you change frames, it's not going to recalculate the motion blur. You do have to restart your IPR if you want to get that motion blur back in there. But what I wanted to show you was just that shutter speed in action. So generally speaking, a normal amount of motion blur is going to be a shutter speed around 48, 60, somewhere around there. You can see if I set my shutter speed to like 10, and let's redo that IPR real quick. You can see I'm getting a very large amount of motion blur, and you can see I'm letting in much more light into the camera. That sphere is streaking much more. So it's a little bit different of a way to think about this. Previously, motion blur was calculated as frames. And so, you may not be in this mindset of motion blur to shutter speed. So you may want to say, blur my objects half of a frame of its distance. And even if, if you're not used to thinking about the motion blur in this way, you do not have the ability to just turn on motion blur in the render settings. If you have Vray physical camera turned on, the motion blur checkbox right here is going to override this, and if it's off, it's also going to be overriding it. So I do want to make sure that that's clear, that if you're using the Vray physical camera, you do have to use the shutter speed here. It's one of the reasons why it's really not a big deal. You kind of get used to it. You may say, you can always compare back as well. So like if I stop this render and I turn off my physical camera real quick, turn on my motion blur, let's set the duration to 0.5. A half of a frame is a fairly normal amount of motion blur. Sometimes it's a teeny bit high, depending on what the context of our shot is. We can go a little higher or a little lower. If you're matching live action, it's always very easy. So just, visually see what you're going to be matching. You can see actually 0.5 basically looks exactly the same. So you can stop that. And 0.5 actually makes perfect sense that it's 0.5, because if I go back and turn on my physical camera, the shutter speed of 48th, that is essentially 1/48th of a second, or in other words, 0.5, because we're only doing, we're taking in half as much time as a one frame of my animation, which is 24 frames per second. So that's exactly why 48 is a pretty normal shutter speed amount. But if you want a little bit more than that, you could go a little bit lower, or what may be more common is that you want a little bit less. And so if you want a little bit less here, maybe we want to go down to 60. Let's IPR. You can see that's now, it's subtle, but it's there, that it's a little bit more, a little bit less motion blur. Now I can go in and start playing with that ISO. So let's go ahead and select our camera. Let's turn on a full IPR again. And you can see that's a little bit darker, so I can go in and maybe dial that ISO a little bit higher, say something like 1200. Maybe even higher than that, 2000. So you can see that's really, really bright. For me, 1500. Cool. Okay, so let's throw our focus back to our board in the background again. And just kind of going down here, I want you to take note that we do have a white balance adjustment if we want. This makes it so that you can establish a color that's going to be white. In this case, I have a very cool image, so you can see if I start making that color blue, that it'll tint the whole thing based on that. This is very much something that I always leave to comp. You really don't want to bake in such a harsh color adjustment into your final image when you're going into post-production, and you can change all of that anyways. The one time I see people using this kind of stuff is artists who are not going to be going to Photoshop or Nuke or After Effects or anything, and they're just sending this one image directly out of the My Render view. You could play with that a little bit potentially. Even if I'm doing a posting for clients or directors or whatever, I almost always will send my work through that small bit of post process just to really polish it. And so I really highly recommend that some of this stuff be left alone in the physical camera and you get more accustomed to post-production instead. Same thing right below, we have the vignette. I'm going to turn that off. And you can see it got a little bit brighter. Let's redo our IPR again also. Actually, let's go to frame 31 again as well. Turn on that IPR. And because of the lighting in our scene, there's kind of a natural vignette in the lighting. But you can see if I turn on the vignette, let's just get a little box right here. And then if I just draw a second box and turn that vignette off, it's pretty subtle. You can see there's a very faint line there. Even if I go and crank the vignette up to like 3, you can see that it's really starting to darken that area down a little bit. So, but again, to reiterate, this is always something you can do and control in post. And so going in and baking in such an intense vignette effect into your final image is really not going to be ideal at all. Let's set that back to 1 and we'll turn off that vignette. And now let's go right down, just kind of cruise through the rest of these attributes here. You can see that we've got next turning on our bokeh effects. And let's actually shove that focus back to these. Actually, let's turn off our motion blur. And our sphere here, let's kind of shrink it down. And let's assign that V-Ray light material. So we got a really nice bright ball of light. And what I'm going to do just to show this, you do have the ability to do things like blades in your focus. So your bokeh has a bit of shape to it. So let's do like a hexagon, and I'm going to set my f-stop very low again to 1.4. You can see that we need to now readjust the rest of our scene, so I can dial my ISO back down, maybe even lower than 100 to 50. Cool, that feels pretty good. And now you can see, because I have this very, very bright white sphere right here, that I'm creating this really beautiful hexagon shape in the bokeh. And so that those shapes like that to render are going to be very intensive. If it's possible to do your depth of field in comp, sometimes you can get some nicer looking effects. There's obviously going to be many circumstances where you have to do your depth of field in CG. For example, refraction can be a very difficult thing to do in post, depth of field in post. If you have the render resources at a large company, it's very common to do depth of field in camera rather than doing it as a post process. But I'm actually at a medium-sized company, and it's even at a medium-sized company, because the render times get so intense, it's a little bit more rare to be able to do depth of field in camera. You can also see we do have this new attribute for cat's eye bokeh. And so you can see the idea here is that as our object gets closer to the edge of frame, we will get a different shape in that bokeh. And this is usually stronger in wide angle lenses. So let's actually go in and see if we can get a little bit. Let's unlock this. And we'll set this to maybe 22. And let's just see if we can move that sphere again right up into the edge of our screen. Cool, yeah, so you can definitely see it in this example here. So what I did was I just had to take the focus distance quite a bit lower to really shove that out of focus. You can see there's a really nice like bend happening in this bokeh now. And if let's make this a little wider as well, so we have a little bit more room across the top. And now you can see as I move that point right, like way up into the corner of that frame, we get this really beautiful warping effect on that bokeh. So that's a new feature. It's a really nice one on that physical camera. And as you're playing around with this, there's also, you can see there's these other options here. So if you wanted, you can rotate that around until you, let's say, there it is, 30 would be our vertical. And you can also, let's just check our little box here so that refreshes really quickly. You can see that we have a anisotropy, which will stretch it vertically or horizontally. So if you wanted to give that impression of, the anamorphic lenses or something like that, we can crank this back down to 1080 720 and IPR that. Bring this back over here. We can select our sphere and move him back down into frame because now he's off frame. There it is. You can see there's starting to be a really interesting effect that we've got going on here. So there's our bokeh, and as I move it over to the other side, it's feeling pretty cool. So let's bring this right back over there, shrink down our render region box, and look at the last attribute of our bokeh here, which is going to be this center bias. And so the center bias is going to give you the ability to have some rings, and a lot of times with really nice lenses, you really don't see very much of that at all. But you can go in. What I actually think looks nicer in a lot of cases is putting the center bias a little negative like that. And you can see you get a little bit of that, a little bright spot in the center, maybe negative 0.35. That'll give us a little bit of that center hotspot. If you did the other directions, maybe a positive 0.25, you can get a little bit of that ring kind of happening. So, I really just treat this, as a art directable thing. I don't really think about it too much. It's just really what I feel looks nicer in whatever situation that I'm in. So that's really a rundown of the physical camera, and I want to reiterate here that a lot of these settings are really cool unless you're using the depth of field. There's really not a lot of reason to take advantage of some of these settings here. And you can see, like if you're doing something very wide, so maybe let's set our distortion amount. Our distortion amount's at 1 right now because we have a really wide angle lens. If you're only doing a little bit of distortion, you may want to do that in comp. The vignette you almost always want to do in comp. White balance you always want to do in comp. The main benefit to me from this physical camera is really the options in the depth of field, and dialing those values with an f-stop number. Or if I'm in a live action pipeline where I know specific values on a real camera, and I can match those to this world, and then I can get much more realistic values on my lights as well. So hopefully you can see the benefit of this, but also see some of the disadvantages as well. There's a lot of tutorials that I feel kind of overhype this set of attributes, and so I want you to be clear that it's it's a very powerful tool, but you have to use it where you really need it, not just toss it on everything all the time. So, but as you can see, you can, make some really beautiful effects as I'm creating right now with these little. Let's see if we can create a whole bunch of little bouquets across the top of our frame. You can do some really cool stuff. It's definitely pretty amazing. So have some fun with it. Don't forget you've got it turned on. You might make yourself a little get a little frustrating sometimes. I actually will have it on in some of these example files in our single object properties demo. The single object properties demo it's going to be on. The last thing that I kind of want to talk about, let's turn this off. So I was setting up this scene just to be a kind of nice example file. I wanted to show, while this is rendering, a little bit of an explanation of this. I want to show all these stuck buckets here. It's pretty interesting. If you look, I created this bouquet group, these little tiny white, green specks. I hope you can see them in the video. I'm sure the compressed QuickTime is going to make them super obvious. Let me scale them up so that you can actually see them. So you can kind of see. So those are our little specs that we've got creating those bouquet shapes. Let me scale this back down. So I've got them very tiny. I've got them fairly close to camera. They're only 100 units away, so they're really kind of blooming out. When you're rendering depth of field, this is kind of a physical camera / depth of field lesson. You do have an immense amount of anti-alias samples that need to happen. You can actually see this very clearly. If you look at your sample rate pass, even the way it is right now at 1 in 100, Vray still is having a kind of hard time going in and really figuring out the rest of these samples. You can actually see, due to the bucket size, this one got chopped off on the side. I may have to do smaller buckets than where I'm at right now. What happened was that sphere bloomed out in a different bucket, didn't carry over. You can see even with the fix to some of the bucket size optimizations, I still have a couple stuck buckets right here calculating those final bouquets. So you can definitely see that it's a very difficult thing to render out. So it's quite helpful to go in and actually render your render with a nice amount of render layers and render out, break out your render layers through depth. So like foreground, midground, background, like we do in our single object properties explanation, so that you can really do this stuff in post. These bouquet shapes are quite easy to get inside of Nuke, and they're very difficult to sample properly on the Maya side. So you can see I duplicated a couple boards, brought them forward so that they're kind of pushed out of focus. Our light source is in the center. We've kind of still got that fill light in here. I'm going to save this scene file out. And you can see this this is a single proc computer, 960 by 360. This took 2 minutes. This took 3 minutes. And you saw a significant chunk of that was just sitting rendering out those bouquet shapes. I'm going to keep the scene file saved. I'm not going to save this next one, but just so you can kind of see the difference here, I am going to go in and turn off the enable bouquet effects and simply have the spherical shapes, and we'll be able to see the render time difference. So actually, you can see this took even longer, which I did not expect. I did actually think that would be faster. The bouquets are actually cut off worse as well. Not really sure what happened, but I wanted to show you that was kind of a failed experiment. You can see I am kind of creating a very difficult thing to render, but seeing how a lot of these artifacts, you could imagine if this frame took 2 hours, maybe even more than that with the depth of field at full res, 5-6 hours a frame, if your bouquet shapes were starting to get cut off like this, that could be a really major problem. So you have to definitely keep an eye on this and just kind of be mindful of that stuff when you're rendering this out. Again, I am creating a very specifically difficult render problem here, with these really hard bokeh shapes for V-Ray to go in and figure that out. But yeah, so the last part of the V-Ray physical camera that we want to talk about, I kind of touched on this a little bit, is really just the way it ties into other physical properties of V-Ray. And I mentioned before that if you are taking HDRs of lights on a set, or taking really high quality environment HDRIs with really nice values in them, that you may find that having that control over the physical camera will benefit you, where you can tie it into the properties on the camera that you're using on set for a shot, and then you have a really high quality HDRI with really bright values, so it all kind of evens out and ties together nicely. One kind of example of this happening inside of V-Ray with purely V-Ray attributes is actually the V-Ray Sun and Sky. So I'm going to just go ahead and create a sun and create a sky. And let me turn off my physical camera first. And let's just grab our sun shape here and get it kind of low, casting some shadows through the scene. And let's IPR that. And that's what it looks like. Solid, white, light. But what's pretty cool, if you have been using if you've been using the V-Ray Sun and Sky, the first thing you may have done is gone in and selected the sun and just, taken the intensity multiplier and set it to like 0.1 or, whatever that may be. But you really don't even have to do that. You can go in, and if I select my physical camera, if you remember, the physical camera defaulted to an f-stop of 8. That default f-stop of 8 actually does a pretty nice job just going in, and it looks like I'm getting a kind of funky shadow off of my card here. Let me just hide that. There we go. That's looking better now. That default value of 8 actually ties into the V-Ray Sun and Sky quite nicely. You can see that my focus is a little bit, actually quite a bit deeper than it used to be. Even before, these guys were pretty out of focus, and now they're fairly in focus. If I go in that shot camera again, you can even see if I was to go in and, let's say, on those physical camera properties, we can set this f-stop, to something pretty high, like a 22. I could keep everything in very sharp focus, and then I could increase the shutter speed a little bit to brighten that image, or I could also increase my ISO, something like that. So the intensity of the sun is fairly correct. It is physically accurate, and so going in and dialing the intensity down will work if you're not using the physical camera. But if you do want to go in and just have the physical camera turned on, you can just use that higher f-stop number and get a pretty nice value range going through without having to adjust any other settings. So it's pretty cool. So that kind of concludes the physical camera. Just to kind of wrap up here, I do want to just reiterate really quick and remind you to be very careful about using stuff like white balance and vignettes and baking those into your final image. You absolutely want to turn those off if you're going into compositing of any kind, like Nuke, After Effects, even Photoshop. You want to turn that stuff off and do it on that end, in the post end instead. Lastly, if you are not doing in-camera depth of field and not messing with any type of distortion in your camera, think really hard about using this, because you may be able to get the same exact effect totally not using it and just going in and dialing your lights manually. So it's really up to you at the end of the day, of course. I'm kind of a fan of it. I think it's a pretty cool, you set this. So see now the intensity of this light is not the same compared to the sun. So there's definitely something to be said about having that sun at a brightness of 1 and going in and dialing the physical camera instead. So there's always these pros and cons of everything. So just play around with it, get your own feel for it, and definitely see what you think. So that's the physical camera.